If you are a teacher, you have students in your classroom who speak a different language than English. I have a class with 6 different languages represented, and people ask me all the time whether I speak all these languages, and the answer to that question is no. But as a teacher, it's still my job to make sure that every single student has access to high quality instruction. We can do this. In fact, it's actually easier than ever. Teachers can use AI to deliver on a research-proven framework so that every single student can access grade-level content, even if they're new to English. So I think this is worth a couple minutes. Let's jump in. So here we found ourselves looking at the dashboard of Colleague AI, which is one of the many AI and education platforms that exist for teachers today. And if we look around, there are so many different tools I can use, and I'll use a couple of them to make a podcast. I'll make multiple supporting texts, several assessment options, online interactive grammar activity, rubrics, all within a 90-minute planning period. I'll use best practices along the way, and I'll use this tool ethically while I try really hard to close the achievement gap. So I usually start with the Brainstorm Ideas tool because I want to explore lesson ideas where students are reading and speaking and listening and writing. And once I begin, I have this organic conversation around my content that is supporting the English language arts and how this overlaps with my pedagogy, which is the theory and practice of effective teaching. And I am using a research-based framework called SIOP, which is known to be a good teaching model. It's known to work really well for students who are new to English. And when I'm working with Colleague AI, it understands this framework because it's literally trained on all the best pedagogical literature, which in this case includes these 8 components. But we know that if I can incorporate them across my lesson plan, then every single student will have access to meaningful grade level content. And for this lesson sequence, the grade level text that we're working through is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. And from this dialogue, I'm starting to have a pretty good start on my lesson preparation. And now I'm starting to think about building background so that I can support this novel. So I'll go to the Generate Podcast tool where I can begin to build entry points for this grade level standard that is determine a central theme or idea and analyze it in detail. But let's be honest, some students will definitely have a harder time meeting the standard than others, especially if they're still learning core theme vocabulary, which for this book could be resilience, which, by the way, is a college readiness word that every single student should know. So I'll ask the podcast tool to make me a podcast that discusses resilience as it pertains to overcoming adversity. And once I click generate, it creates this interactive dialogue. And if I scroll down to the bottom here, it gives me this custom audio content. In fact, let's take a second. Let's hear what this sounds like in the classroom.
Resilience is one of those words we toss around a lot, but you're right, it deserves a closer look.
Wow, that's amazing because in less than 10 minutes, I'm delivering on lesson preparation, building background, comprehensible input. I'll print this transcript so we can exercise learning strategies, which I'll talk about later. But I'm providing students with an entry point and they get to hear it, read it, and they get to talk about it and more, but I'm still not done building background around this core skill. And I'm thinking about practice and application, and I'm thinking about interaction. And so watch, I'll take these thoughts to the Generate Task with Different Rigor tool. And here, I'll ask it to make me 2 different texts that fit my students' reading level. The topic of these texts will support another potential theme, the struggle for belonging, or I don't know, maybe how we can work together to find our place in the world. And I'll write prompts that consider this content, and I'll steer this conversation based on these best pedagogical practices. And Colleague AI helps me to build and synthesize 2 supplementary texts that are intentionally and directly connected to various chapters in Born a Crime. And at this point, I spent like 30 minutes on this lesson prep, and I'm starting to have some pretty solid content. I have a podcast, I have 2 accessible texts that are connecting to student backgrounds, and they're practicing their reading, they're practicing their listening. But I want to take this practice a little bit further, so I'm going to save these readings to my hard drive, and I'm going to open the text-dependent question tool. In this tool, I can upload these texts, and I can prompt the AI to make me comprehension questions. That way I know whether or not my students are understanding the text. A 2-part question on theme, which is modeled directly after a state testing question, cross-text connection questions so that they can interact with each other, and that analysis question, that higher order thinking question that will be a written response ultimately demonstrating their ability to meet this grade level standard. And it does this. It makes questions for both texts, and after a few minutes of refining, I'm starting to hit on components of interaction, practice and application, and assessment. Now, of course, like we all know this, every class has those kids who fly through your practice, and so I'm going to build an extension activity. I'll go to the Generate Interactive tool, and I'll ask it to make me a vocabulary exercise. And once I click Generate, it builds an online vocabulary activity that students can use in Colleague AI's classroom feature. And yes, there are student-facing AI features here. And when I'm done, or when students are done, Colleague AI will generate some pretty comprehensive data around how students are performing in this area, which would be really helpful for me later as a sample metric for how students are performing. Here we go. This is it. My planning period is just about over. I've considered my subject and my content area, my best pedagogical strategies every step of the way. The generation of content is pretty quick and it's honestly pretty easy, but the bulk of my time here is spent ensuring the ethical use of this tool as I'm operating within school policy. I'm transparent with my students, thinking critically about everything that's generated. I'm checking for hallucination. But ultimately, I have this high volume of quality content that will support my students in having meaningful human interactions that are grounded in the content learning that we're aiming for here. But with that said, I need to head down to the copy room. I need to print some stuff, and I hope you stick around for a couple more minutes just so I can show you what the student experience might be like in this lesson sequence. After students walk through this door, we're going to talk about the language and the content objectives that we have for this class before we jump into all of the comprehensible materials that we've prepared. We'll explicitly review annotation and learning strategies, and then they're going to practice these strategies with this transcript. Once they're done with this, they'll practice their reading skills with texts that I know they can read. They'll read these independently at first, and then they're going to get into groups and they're going to interact with people who have the same text with them, and they'll practice and they'll rehearse answering questions about the text. Because then they're going to get into groups with someone who had a different reading from them, and they're going to speak with each other, and they're going to have to listen to each other, and they're going to have to think critically while they record responses around these texts. And during this whole lesson delivery, I'm not doing very much. Students are the ones who are doing all the work, and they're doing all the thinking. They have full ownership over this whole lesson. I'm just there to facilitate the experience and offer support where I'm needed, and I'll organize transitions. For example, when I notice that they're ready, we're going to jump into the vocabulary interactive that we built, as well as the writing assessment, the analysis question, while I pull them one-on-one for verbal assessments. And I'm going to score all of this using a rubric based on grade level standards that we're working towards. And this is good because it helps me equitably score them. And yes, there's a tool for that. So seriously, I hope that you can see that we can do this. We can support every single kid, even though they come from very different places. And also, for the purpose of this video, I did simplify my prompts and a little bit of my AI process. So I encourage you to go check out the University of Washington's AI Competency Educator Badge. This is a framework that helps guide educators on how we can use these tools effectively. And there are several AI and education tools. I'm using Colleague AI because my district supports it, and I'm so glad that they do. I would recommend this to any district, to any teacher, because it has so many amazing tools focused towards me, the teacher, and ones that students can use. But ultimately, by using this technology, I don't have to speak the languages of the world, yet I could still create rich and meaningful whole student-focused learning experiences, as that's my job. And it's literally up to us to decide how we bring every student into the center of our lesson plans. It's so important that we have critical thinkers who can collaborate with each other, because these are the young humans who are going to help solve the most challenging problems in our world.